Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right in, because today we are unpacking a really wild, highly controversial literary forgery. We're looking at a supposedly lost manuscript attributed to the legendary Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. It's titled The Aleph of Attention and the Garden of Forking Readers. But, we aren't just going to read this thing. We're putting it on trial. We're going to examine three razor-sharp critical perspectives that totally tear this manuscript apart. And yet, spoiler alert, they actually find something profoundly beautiful right at its core. Just to set the stage here, one of the critics described this text as the literary equivalent of someone trying to explain a dream they had about a library while high on philosophy textbooks. It's dense, it's looping, and it takes itself almost uncomfortably seriously. The whole thing acts aggressively intellectual, kind of like wearing a velvet blazer to a casual backyard barbecue, As we'll see, it's this crazy labyrinth of references that demands your absolute attention, even while it seemingly mocks you for giving it.
So, here is our docket for today's literary trial. We are going to cover the crime, the charges, the flaw, the defense, and finally, the verdict, as we completely deconstruct this forged masterpiece.
Let's start with part one, the crime. And honestly, it all begins within an incredibly audacious premise.
See, the crime here isn't just mimicking an author's distinct voice. The text isn't just a ventriloquist act of Borges, it is forging the actual physical materiality of the guy's existence. The manuscript opens with this totally fake editor's note that sets a highly specific cinematic scene. It describes the paper as older and brittle, supposedly found stashed in some dusty wooden box. It even goes so far as to point out that the handwriting shows less of the tremor you'd normally associate with a blind old man's hand. I mean, that is a massive escalation. It's a manufactured ancient relic authenticated by a completely fictional editor actively trying to physically insert itself into literary history.
Which brings us to part two, the charges, specifically some intense academic posturing. We have three major offenses on the docket today. First, there's the glossary, which is an absolutely egregious addition we'll dissect in just a second. Second, there's what's called the Claude's Coda. This is a totally unnecessary postscript where the author steps out from behind the mask to basically explain their own trick. Look, a magician who explains their trick is still a magician, sure, but you really have to wonder why they felt so desperately insecure that they had to explain it at all. And finally, the serene deathbed trope. The manuscript relies heavily on this exhausted cliché of a dying historic figure who has perfectly resolved all worldly tension and is now just imparting gentle, flawless wisdom. The whole thing acts like a nervous performer over-explaining itself.
I mean, imagine the sheer audacity of inventing concepts entirely from scratch, like literally making up terms like the Aleph of attention and double vision, and then explicitly tagging the name Borges next to them in a glossary at the back of the book. It's literally hijacking a dead author's authority to validate concepts he never actually came up with. At that point, it stops being a fun literary homage and starts acting like a frantic credential. The author is just desperately trying to prove how smart the text is by forcefully cramming it into an established canon.
7, that is the number of external references stuffed into the glossary of this allegedly secret text. It cross-references absolute heavyweights like Carl Jung, Martin Buber, and Mikkel Bakhtin, not to mention throwing in complex Buddhist concepts and Christian theology. Just think about the absurdity of that for a second. A mystical, secret manuscript supposedly hidden away in a wooden box until the author's death somehow neatly footnotes itself to contemporary dialogical psychology? No way. It turns the glossary into an academic security blanket for a writer who is terrified we won't realize just how smart they are.
All right, moving to part three, the flaw. Because despite all that effort, this is where the mask completely slips.
While the prose does a fantastic job of mimicking his conversational tone and his specific Buenos Aires settings, philosophically, it totally fails. The real Jorge Luis Borges was a rigorous skeptic. He deeply mistrusted mysticism, and his version of the infinite library was essentially a nightmare of meaningless noise. He died still arguing with the universe. But the forged Borges, he just arrives at these neat insights and stays there in perfect tranquility. He is serene, wise, and finds total peace before death. The forgery essentially turns him into a neatly packaged enlightened phenomenology podcaster, giving him a resolution that the real Borges actively refused himself his entire life.
And the illusion shatters completely during the manuscript's most supposedly confident moment. The dying, forged Borges claims to be revealing the ultimate secret of the Library of Babel, something he's supposedly held onto for decades. And what is that earth-shattering secret? That the library doesn't contain all possible books, but rather all possible readings of one single book. Well, the problem there is that it isn't a secret at all. That is a super well-known piece of literary scholarship. Academics have been openly discussing that exact concept since 1941. So the fictional framing totally collapses the second you realize this grand revelation is literally just standard secondary literature.
But wait, let's play devil's advocate for a second. Part 4, the defense. What if this is a self-referential trap? There's actually a fascinating counter-argument to consider before we totally write this thing off. What if leaning into the tackiness of these academic tropes isn't pretentious, but performative? It's entirely possible the text is a highly self-aware roast of academics and that desperate, cliched impulse to seek profound meaning in dusty wooden boxes. Think about it. If a reader is frantically searching for deep truths in a text that spends half its time just bragging about how smart it is, the text has successfully trapped the reader. It tricks you into becoming the exact thing it's mocking, someone desperately trying to feel smarter just by associating with the material.
When we look across the 3 different analytical engines we consulted to roast this text, some pretty distinct themes emerge. Claude highlights institutional overreach, pointing out how the fake editor's notes and glossaries actively ruin the central mystery. Gemini calls out the academic flex, nailing that endless name-dropping used to create a false sense of depth. And Grok just straight-up labels the whole thing recursive, unhinged fanfiction. It basically summarizes the manuscript as the literary equivalent of wearing a tuxedo to Burning Man and then giving a TED Talk about how the fire is a metaphor for consciousness. It is aggressively meta, looping back on itself so many times it almost becomes elegant again.
Which brings us to our final stop, part 5, the verdict. Because underneath all the posturing, there is a genuinely profound core here. If you strip away the purple prose, the endless name-dropping, and all that academic flexing, there is an absolutely beautiful insight hidden in here. The text argues that deep attention and deep reading literally create a ghostly third presence in the relationship between the author and the reader. When you fully, truly engage with a text, it isn't just you and it isn't just the author anymore. It's a unique entity born directly in the threshold of that shared attention. The manuscript explicitly asks the reader to notice who turns the page with you, carrying this chilling, amazing implication that the text itself is reading you right back.
It's a staggering thought, right? So I'll leave you with that terrifyingly beautiful concept to ponder today. As you engage with this explainer, as you sit here processing all this information, what third, ghostly entity is sitting in the threshold of attention with you right now? Who is turning the page with you? Think about that. Catch you next time.